Sterling Heights was a quiet, upscale neighborhood, the kind where the grass stayed green, and the mailboxes all looked the same. The homes were large, the driveways were long, and most of the residents liked things exactly the way they were. Among them was a woman named Karen Whitmore. Karen had lived in Sterling Heights for over a decade. She wasn't part of the homeowners association officially, but everyone treated her like she was. Karen liked to keep an eye on things, and if a neighbor played music too loud, she made note. If someone left their trash cans out overnight, she took a picture and sent an email. She believed that keeping order meant keeping the neighborhood safe. To Karen, people who didn't belong were easy to spot. And this morning, she thought she had spotted one. It was just before 10 a.m. when a sleek, black sedan pulled into her cul-de-sac. It was a newer model, clean, expensive, but Karen didn't recognize it. And she recognized every car on that street. The car rolled to a stop right in front of her lawn. Karen stood behind her curtain, staring. A tall black man stepped out. He looked well-dressed, button-down shirt, brown loafers, and jeans. He moved calmly, with purpose, like he knew exactly what he was doing. He leaned against his car and looked at his phone. Karen raised an eyebrow. That parking spot wasn't assigned to anyone, but for years it had been understood. That was Karen's spot. Her family didn't even use it much, but it was hers. She watched him for a minute, then stepped outside with her clipboard. She walked over, trying to sound polite but firm. "Excuse me," she said. "Can I help you? This is a private neighborhood." The man looked up and gave a slight smile. "No help needed. I'm just waiting for a delivery." Karen didn't like that answer. "Well," she said, "we don't usually have people parking here unless they live in the neighborhood. If this story is captivating, please like and subscribe to our channel so we can keep creating more content like this." He nodded. "Understood." Karen stared at him for a second. "You're not visiting someone, are you?" "No," he said. "Just waiting." Karen shifted her weight. "This cul-de-sac is for residents. It's not a public space." He looked over at the sidewalk, then back at her. "There's no sign that says I can't park here." Karen crossed her arms. "Some of us have lived here a long time. We like to keep things in order." "I'm not causing any trouble," he said. She didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her phone and took a photo of the car. The man didn't flinch. He just stood there quietly. Karen wasn't used to being ignored. She especially wasn't used to being ignored by someone she had already decided didn't belong. She took another picture. "I'm going to call the HOA. They'll handle it." "All right," the man said. "I'll be here." Karen didn't expect that. No protest. No fear. Just patience. She walked back toward her house, dialing as she went. She called the head of security, a man named Gary who handled complaints for the estate. While she waited for someone to pick up, she looked back at the man leaning against his car. He didn't look nervous. He wasn't pacing or checking over his shoulder. He just stood there, peaceful and calm. Karen tightened her grip on the phone. She was used to people being nervous when she got involved, but this man didn't even seem fazed, and that made her even more suspicious. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the man she was trying to report didn't just live in the neighborhood. He owned it. Gary, the head of estate security, picked up on the second ring. "Morning, Ms. Whitmore. Everything all right?" Karen's voice was already sharp. "No, Gary. There's a car parked directly in front of my house. I don't recognize it, and the man standing beside it refuses to leave." Gary paused. "Did he say why he's there?" Karen scoffed. "Said he's waiting for a delivery. But there's no reason for anyone to be parked right there. This is a private cul-de-sac. We've dealt with this before, remember?" Gary sighed. "I'll be there in a few minutes." Karen hung up, already feeling victorious. She walked back to her porch and crossed her arms. The man was still there, now leaning into the car and pulling out a paper bag, groceries. A few fresh items, nothing out of the ordinary. He didn't seem to be in any rush. Karen watched every move. He didn't look around nervously. He didn't act guilty. If anything, he looked comfortable. That bothered her even more. She wasn't used to people standing their ground around her. Not when she had the clipboard in hand. Not when she had the rules on her side. To her, this wasn't about a parking space. It was about respect. About understanding who belongs and who doesn't. so she stepped off the porch again. She cleared her throat loudly as she approached. You know, it's a bit rude to ignore residents when they've told you this is private property. He looked at her again, still calm. I told you I'm waiting, not trying to cause a scene. Karen tightened her lips. Well, you're drawing attention. People work hard to live here, and we don't need unknown cars showing up out of nowhere. He raised an eyebrow. Unknown? Do you know everyone in this neighborhood? I know enough, she said flatly. He nodded and looked away for a second, like he didn't want to say what was on his mind. Then quietly he said, I think you're assuming a lot more than you know. Karen didn't like that. Before she could respond, a black security SUV pulled into the street and stopped a few feet away. Gary stepped out. He was in his late 40s, with tired eyes and a gentle voice. He looked between Karen and the man beside the car. Karen took the lead immediately. This is the car I was talking about. He's been out here for a while. Says he's waiting for something, but refuses to tell me who he's here for. Gary nodded and turned to the man. Sir, good morning. Do you mind me asking your name? The man gave a small smile. Langston. Elijah Langston. Gary froze for a split second. Then his posture changed, just a little. Karen noticed it, but didn't understand it. Gary stepped closer and lowered his voice. Mr. Langston, I didn't know you were planning to visit today. Everything all right? Karen's face changed. She looked at Gary, confused. Wait, you know him? Gary looked at her, unsure how much to say. Elijah Langston is one of the estate's principal investors, he said quietly. His company funded most of the second phase development. Karen blinked. Investor? You mean he works for the people who built the neighborhood? Elijah looked directly at her. His voice was calm. No, I own the company that built this neighborhood. Silence. Karen felt like the ground under her shoes shifted. She opened her mouth, then closed it. This wasn't a prank. He wasn't bluffing. Gary confirmed it. Elijah's name is on most of the original land records, he added. You probably didn't know, because he's not public about it. Elijah shrugged. I don't live here, but I stop by now and then, just to make sure everything's still in good shape. He looked at her then, not angry, not smug, just quietly watching. Karen swallowed hard. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Elijah added, I never said anything because I didn't need to, but since we're being thorough today. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a manila folder. Inside was the original land deed, stamped and signed. Karen didn't ask to see it, but she saw enough of the seal to know it was real. Her cheeks flushed. It wasn't embarrassment. Not yet. It was confusion, discomfort, a sense that the balance of power had shifted and she didn't know what to do with it. Gary cleared his throat. Is there anything else you need, Ms. Whitmore? Karen shook her head slowly. No, I didn't realize. Gary nodded. All right then, Mr. Langston, if you need anything, just call me. Elijah gave a polite nod. Will do. Gary got back in the SUV and drove off, leaving just the two of them standing there. Karen couldn't look Elijah in the eye. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she muttered. You didn't, Elijah said. You just made assumptions. He wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to make her feel small, but he didn't need to. The facts did that on their own. Karen turned and walked back to her house, slower this time. She didn't slam the door. She didn't call the HOA again. She sat down at her dining table and stared out the window. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say. Karen sat by her window, watching Elijah Langston through the sheer curtains. He hadn't left. He was still standing next to his car, now sipping water from a bottle, occasionally checking his phone. No fear, no urgency. He belonged here, and that truth was finally sinking in. Karen's thoughts spiraled quietly. She'd never heard the name Elijah Langston before, not in neighborhood newsletters, not in HOA updates, not even in the email chain she was part of. But now that name was all she could think about. He didn't just own the car in front of her house. He owned the ground beneath it. And worse, he hadn't flaunted it. He had stood there silently while she tried to intimidate him, while she snapped photos and made calls. He had all the power in the situation, and yet he never used it to humiliate her. That made it harder. Back outside, Elijah's delivery finally arrived. It was a small courier van. A young woman stepped out with a clipboard and a padded envelope. They exchanged a few polite words, and she handed it over. He signed, thanked her, then walked slowly back to his car. Karen noticed something. Before opening the driver's side door, Elijah paused and looked up at her window, just briefly. Then he got in. The engine purred quietly, and he drove away without another word. The silence he left behind echoed louder than any insult could have. Karen wasn't sure why it stayed with her. Maybe it was because she'd always believed she had a sixth sense, that she could read people. But this time she'd gotten it completely wrong. A few days later, the HOA sent out their monthly bulletin. For the first time ever, it featured a section titled, "Behind Sterling Heights, Meet the Visionaries Who Built Our Community." Right at the top was Elijah Langston. It included a photo of him standing beside a blueprint, smiling, proud, hands tucked into his back pockets. The article was short but powerful. It explained how Elijah's construction and development firm partnered with city planners to preserve green space while building luxury homes. It mentioned his scholarships for young architects, his quiet donations to nearby public schools, and his consistent choice to stay out of the spotlight. He never bought one of the homes in the estate, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't need to. To him, the work spoke for itself. Karen read the article twice. The words were polite, factual, but they revealed something about Elijah that she hadn't seen before, and maybe never would have. He wasn't interested in recognition. He wasn't trying to prove himself to anyone. He was the kind of man who didn't care if people knew he was the owner. He cared that the neighborhood stayed beautiful. He cared that people felt safe. And ironically, that made him more of a resident than Karen had ever been. The next morning, Karen did something she hadn't done in years. She walked down to the HOA office in person. The receptionist was surprised to see her. Karen always emailed. "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore," the woman said, looking up from her desk. "Everything okay?" Karen hesitated for a moment. "I just had a question about the article in the bulletin," she said. "Sure," the receptionist replied. "Elijah Langston, has he always been involved in the estate?" The receptionist smiled. "Since the beginning. He doesn't attend the meetings, but he's always watching from the background. If the board ever needs advice or funding for a project, he's usually the one who steps up." Karen nodded slowly. "I see." There was a pause. Then she added, I always thought I had a good eye for character." The receptionist smiled again, but said nothing. Karen turned and walked out, feeling different. Not ashamed, exactly, but unsettled. Back home, she walked to the spot in front of her lawn, the very place she had tried to defend like a fortress. She stood there for a while, thinking about how much had happened in such a small space. Then something unexpected happened. A gray SUV pulled into the cul-de-sac. It was Elijah. He stepped out of the vehicle, holding a large manila envelope. Karen froze. Their eyes met. She took a breath, then walked toward him. Before she could speak, Elijah raised the envelope. "I thought you might want to see this," he said. Karen took it slowly. Inside was a printed layout of the neighborhood, including an early concept sketch of a cul-de-sac. There in the margin was a note from Elijah, handwritten. This spot was designed as a resting space for delivery drivers, for visitors, for anyone who needed a moment. Karen looked up at him. "I didn't realize," she said quietly. Elijah nodded. "You didn't ask." Another pause. Karen lowered her eyes. "I shouldn't have treated you that way." He gave a small smile. "It happens more than you'd think." "I believe you," she said. "Still, I'm sorry." This time, Elijah looked genuinely surprised. Not because someone apologized, but because it came from someone who didn't have to. Someone who was used to being right. "I accept that," he said. They stood in silence for a moment. Then he added, "You take care, Ms. Whitmore." And just like that, he turned and walked back to his car. Karen stood there, watching as he pulled away for the second time. This time, she didn't feel the need to rush inside or hide behind a curtain. She simply stood and reflected. For the first time in a long time, she was learning, and that more than anything meant something. 2 days later, Karen was back to her routine, watering her tulips, wiping down the mailbox, checking that no one left trash bins out longer than the HOA guidelines allowed. But something had changed. She was quieter now, less alert, less sharp. Even the way she watched the street had softened, like she wasn't sure whether she was still the one keeping order, or if order had been there all along, without her help. But the neighborhood hadn't changed. Only she had. And Sterling Heights still ran on structure, status, and a whole lot of silent judgment. So when a neighbor knocked on her door later that morning, holding a phone with a concerned look, Karen was pulled right back into her old rhythm. "Karen," the woman said, "you might want to see this." She turned the screen toward her. A photo. Same black Genesis sedan. Same tall man standing beside it. Same spot in front of Karen's house. Taken just 5 minutes ago. Karen blinked. "He's back." The neighbor nodded. "Again, no one knows what he's doing here." Karen didn't ask questions. She grabbed her clipboard. Some habits die hard. Tell us where you are listening from. Let's know how far we travel. By the time she stepped outside, Elijah was already standing by the car, door open, reviewing a stack of documents on the passenger seat. He wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't in anyone's way. But in Karen's mind, this wasn't about parking anymore. It was about clarity, about control. Because even though she'd learned who he was, even though she'd apologized, there was still a small part of her, deep inside, that didn't like being the one who got it wrong. She cleared her throat as she approached. "You're back," she said flatly. Elijah glanced at her. "I am. Anything I can help you with?" "No," he said. "Just taking care of some paperwork." Karen nodded, unsure of what to say next. Then, she made a choice she thought she wouldn't make again. She pulled out her phone and dialed security. Again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't Gary's. It was a younger man new to the job. "Sterling Heights Security. How can I help you?" "Yes," Karen said. "There's a man parked in front of my home again. He was here a few days ago. I know he claims to be an investor, but this is becoming a pattern." There was a pause. Then the security officer said, "Is he causing a disturbance?" "No," Karen admitted, "but he's using our space like an office. It's inappropriate. I'd like someone to come check on it, and if needed, get the vehicle moved." She ended the call and crossed her arms. Elijah didn't say a word. He just kept reviewing his documents. That silence made her nervous. Because it wasn't defensive, it was confident. He wasn't trying to defend himself anymore. He didn't have to. 10 minutes later, a tow truck pulled into the cul-de-sac. Karen hadn't expected that. She had asked for a check-in, not a full removal. The truck came to a stop. A man in overalls stepped out and approached Elijah's car. Karen watched closely, waiting for something to happen. Elijah didn't react. The driver looked at Elijah, then at the license plate. "Sir," he said carefully, "I was told to come check on this vehicle." Elijah smiled. "Go ahead." The man circled the car. No violations. No signs of damage or obstruction. Karen stepped forward. "He's been using the space all week. You can't just let him stay here." The tow driver looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, there's no infraction. It's a public-facing road. I can't tow a car just because someone doesn't like where it's parked." Karen raised her voice slightly. "I'll call the HOA myself." At that moment, a sleek silver car pulled into the cul-de-sac. It was Gary. He had come even though he wasn't on shift, and the look on his face said it all. He stepped out slowly, looked at Elijah, then at Karen. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, "can we talk for a second?" She nodded. Following him a few steps away, Gary lowered his voice. "He's not breaking any rules. You know who he is. You know what he owns." Karen looked flustered. "But he's using the spot like it's his personal driveway." Gary hesitated. "Karen, he developed the street. His name is still on the foundation filings. And between us, his company still holds voting rights on 3 board positions." Karen's eyes widened. "That can't be right." Gary nodded. "It is." She looked over at Elijah again. He was helping the tow driver fold up his paperwork, smiling and thanking him for his time. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even frustrated. He was kind. That made it worse. Because he wasn't fighting her. He wasn't trying to win. He already had. Gary stepped forward and addressed the tow driver. "Thanks for coming, but you won't be needed today." The driver nodded, shook Elijah's hand, and left. Karen stood still, unsure what to say. This time, Elijah walked toward her. He didn't look smug, just tired. "I'm not here to make you uncomfortable, Karen," he said calmly. "I'm here because I built this place. I believed in it." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. "I don't need to park here," Elijah continued. I choose to, because it reminds me of what this neighborhood was meant to be. Inclusive, thoughtful, strong. She looked down, her voice low. I've made a fool of myself. No, Elijah said. You've made a mistake. The only difference is whether you grow from it. And with that, he got back into his car. As the engine started, Karen took a deep breath. She didn't call anyone else that day. She didn't send an email. She just stood there, watching him drive off. And for the first time in a long time, she questioned what kind of neighbor she had been. The next morning, Karen didn't come outside. No tulip watering. No sidewalk sweeping. No clipboard. She stayed inside, blinds half drawn, quietly sipping her tea while watching the cul-de-sac that had once felt like her kingdom. But it didn't feel like that anymore. Not after yesterday. Not after Elijah stood calmly in the middle of her rules and didn't flinch. Even when a tow truck came for his car. What stung most wasn't that he owned the street, or that the HOA respected him more than her. What stung was how gracefully he handled it all. He didn't gloat. He didn't humiliate her. He gave her space to feel embarrassed, without piling on shame. And that made it harder, because it would have been easier if he yelled. Easier if he gave her a reason to push back. But he didn't. He just reminded her, without raising his voice, that maybe she didn't know everything. And maybe she never did. Around noon, Karen's doorbell rang. She hesitated. No one ever dropped by without texting her first. She opened the door slowly. It was Elijah. He was alone. No briefcase. No clipboard. No papers. Just him, holding a brown envelope. Karen stepped back slightly. Elijah? I'm not here to argue, he said. May I come in for 2 minutes? Karen glanced behind her, then opened the door wider. Of course. He stepped in, politely wiping his feet on the doormat. The house smelled like lavender and lemon. Everything was neat, just like the outside. They sat in the living room, across from each other. Elijah placed the envelope gently on the coffee table. Karen looked at it, then back at him. What's that? He took a breath. Some people think I just bought land and made a fortune off this place. But that's not really the full story. Karen stayed quiet. I wasn't born into wealth, he continued. I grew up about 10 miles from here. Small apartment. Single mom. She worked cleaning houses sometimes right in this area. Karen blinked. That part she hadn't expected. When I was a kid, I'd ride with her after school. I'd sit on the steps while she scrubbed baseboards and ironed curtains for women who barely looked her in the eye. He paused. One day, she was cleaning a house that looked just like this one, and she stopped in the hallway, looked around, and whispered to herself, one day, my son is going to own something like this. Not rent it. Own it. Karen looked down at her hands. I never forgot that, he said. He leaned back slightly. I studied architecture, saved money, took jobs no one else wanted, started a company in my late 20s, and made it my mission to build homes for people who were never expected to own one. Karen finally spoke. You built this place. He nodded. Designed every curve of the roads. Fought to keep green space. Lowered the developer fees so middle-class families could qualify. He gestured toward the envelope. And there are the original community plans, and a letter I wrote to the HOA before the first foundation was even poured. Karen picked up the envelope but didn't open it. I wrote something in that letter, Elijah said. A reminder to anyone who forgot how this place began. What did you write? Elijah met her eyes. No one should feel unwelcome here, especially not in silence. Karen swallowed hard. For so long, she'd thought of herself as the protector of the community, but she'd only been protecting a version of it that existed in her mind. A version built on assumption, on silent rules, on keeping things exactly the same. But Elijah had created this place so people could belong, not so they could be monitored, and she'd failed to see that. She opened the envelope and slowly unfolded the papers. Blueprints, HOA letters, notes from city meetings, all with his name on them, all proving what he'd said. And at the bottom of one page, she saw a small handwritten line in faded ink. Respect grows roots where judgment once lived. She closed the folder and looked at him. Why are you showing me this? She asked, her voice quiet. Because I think you care about this neighborhood, Elijah replied. You've just been fighting to protect the wrong version of it. Karen felt her throat tighten. I didn't mean to. No, he said, but intentions don't matter if the impact still hurts. That silence came again, the kind that didn't accuse but still demanded reflection. Then he stood up. I'm not here to embarrass you, Karen. I'm here to remind you this place was meant to be better than what the world outside expects. Karen nodded slowly. I'm sorry, she said. And this time she meant it, not just for calling security, not just for the tow truck, but for every unspoken assumption, every cold glance, every time she chose order over understanding. I hope I can still help this place grow, she added. Elijah smiled. That's up to you. He turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. Oh, one more thing, he said with a slight grin. I parked in front of your lawn again. Karen blinked. Then, for the first time in a long while, she laughed. Not forced, not awkward. A real laugh. Fair enough, she said. He nodded and stepped out the door. And this time, when she watched him leave, there was no clipboard in her hand. Only quiet understanding. Word spreads quickly in places like Sterling Heights. And after Elijah Langston's visit to Karen's home, the quiet streets weren't as quiet as they seemed. Neighbors whispered at mailbox clusters. They lingered a little longer during dog walks. Some even scrolled through old HOA emails, trying to find his name. But they wouldn't find much. Elijah had never needed attention. He never put his face in brochures or showed up at ribbon cuttings. He preferred to be behind the curtain, building, shaping, and stepping back. Still, curiosity had taken hold of the neighborhood, and slowly, the truth began to surface. It started with the real estate office just outside the estate gate. One of the agents there remembered Elijah clearly. She pulled out a binder from 8 years ago, labeled Sterling Heights. Phase 1 founders. Inside were photographs from early meetings, site visits, permits, soil testing reports. And there he was, standing next to city officials, engineers, and architects. In one photo, he was holding a hard hat under one arm and shaking hands with a local inspector. No spotlight, no fanfare, just a man doing his work. That same week, a mother named Teresa, who lived on Birchwood Lane, shared a memory on the community app. Years ago, I was out jogging with my son when he tripped on a loose sidewalk tile. A man driving by stopped, helped us up, and reported the broken pavement to the city that same day. The sidewalk was fixed by the end of the week. I never knew his name until I saw his photo in the newsletter. People began to connect the dots. Elijah had been around all along. He wasn't a stranger. He was the reason the neighborhood existed. And yet, when he returned, some still treated him like an outsider. One Saturday afternoon, the HOA held an open house at the community center. It was part of their annual Resident Voices meeting. This time, the room was fuller than usual. Everyone was buzzing, wondering if Elijah would show up. And he did. Not in a suit, not with an entourage. Just Elijah, wearing a blue polo and slacks, holding a water bottle and a folder. He nodded to the board, shook hands with the property manager, and took a seat in the back row. Quiet, like always. When it was time for resident remarks, something unusual happened. Karen stood up. She wasn't holding her clipboard. She wasn't reading off complaints. She was holding a copy of the blueprint Elijah had given her, and her voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it. Karen, addressing the room. I always thought I understood this neighborhood, that I knew what made it special. But recently, I realized I've spent more time protecting my image of it than understanding where it came from. She paused. I misjudged someone, publicly, repeatedly, and he never once raised his voice at me. Karen looked directly at Elijah. Mr. Langston, I want to thank you, not just for what you built, but for reminding me that respect doesn't always look like we expect it to. The room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another, and another. Elijah stood slowly. He wasn't looking for applause, but he offered a few words. This community is stronger than its fences, and more beautiful than its lawns. I built it because I believed in what people could become if given space to grow. We've all made mistakes, me included. But what matters is what we do after the mistake is made. That was all he said, and it was all he needed to say. The next day, something else changed. A small wooden plaque was installed just outside the community center. Simple, with no gold or flash. It read, Elijah Langston, designer, developer, neighbor. Respect grows roots where judgment once lived. Karen had chosen the quote, and this time she didn't ask the HOA for permission. No one objected. Later that week, as Elijah walked through the neighborhood for the first time without a car, a few residents waved. One offered him a coffee. Another thanked him for the parks. A teenager asked what made him want to design neighborhoods in the first place. He smiled and said, "Because I didn't see myself in any of them, so I made one where I could." That answer stuck with the kid. And Sterling Heights, though still quiet, clean, and rule-following, felt a little different. People made eye contact more often. They lingered in driveways for conversations that weren't just small talk. The HOA stopped issuing passive-aggressive notices for small things like basketball hoops and chalk drawings. It wasn't a revolution, but it was real, the kind of change that didn't show up on paper, but echoed through every silent moment where someone once felt like they didn't belong. Karen kept the envelope Elijah gave her in a drawer beside her bed. Every so often, she'd take it out and read the handwritten line again. No one should feel unwelcome here, especially not in silence. It had taken her too long to understand it, but she had. And that, in the end, mattered more than getting it right the first time. The parking spot in front of Karen's lawn was never officially claimed. There was no sign, no paint, no lock, but it had always been hers, not by rule, by rhythm, until Elijah Langston parked there and didn't move, not because he was stubborn, but because he had nothing to prove and everything already earned. Now, weeks later, that same space stayed empty most days, not by law, not by fear, but by quiet respect. Karen never used it again, not because she wasn't allowed, but because something inside her had changed. And sometimes the simplest way to show growth is to make room for others. If you have a story about a Karen, share it in the comment section so we can make fun about it. It was a cool Sunday morning when it happened. Elijah returned, this time with a box of books for the community library donation drive. He parked in front of Karen's lawn again. But now it felt normal, natural. She saw the car from her window and smiled. She stepped outside, waving lightly. "Need help with the box?" Elijah looked up, surprised, but smiled back. "Sure, it's heavier than I thought." She walked over without her clipboard. For the first time in 12 years, her hands were free. No complaints, no assumptions, just kindness. They walked together down the path to the library box, talking about weather, traffic, and how the birds had been louder lately. It was small talk, yes, but it felt different. It wasn't coated in suspicion or coated with politeness. It was human. When they dropped off the books, Elijah pulled out a final envelope and handed it to her. "I found this when I was going through old files. Thought you might want to see it." Karen opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of her original HOA application, back when she first moved into Sterling Heights. Her handwriting was neat. She had written in the margin, "Excited to be part of a neighborhood that feels like home." Karen exhaled. "I forgot I wrote that," she whispered. "You didn't forget," Elijah said. "You just got busy protecting something and forgot what it was." She nodded slowly. "I think I lost a plot somewhere along the way." "Then it's good we're writing a new one," he said gently. A few days later, the HOA rolled out a new initiative, Community Care Week. It wasn't just cleanup or gardening. It was conversations. Each street hosted small gatherings, story circles, book exchanges, meet your neighbor games. The idea had come from Elijah, and Karen helped lead it. At the first meeting, she stood before a group of 12 people, residents of all ages and backgrounds. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't performing. She just spoke. "For a long time, I thought my job here was to keep things in order. But I've come to realize, sometimes, order means listening. It means stepping aside and letting people show you who they are before you decide." Someone clapped. Then another. Elijah stood quietly at the back, arms crossed, nodding once. Karen caught his eye and gave a small smile, a real one. Over time, people began to tell new stories. Stories of how Elijah once paid off a neighbor's repair bill anonymously. Stories of how he sent books to the local elementary school. Stories of how he used to walk through unfinished sites at night just to make sure everything felt safe. He never needed credit. He only needed the work to matter. And it did. More than anyone realized. Karen kept the Langston folder in her home office now, labeled and dated, not to remind her of her mistake, but to remind her of how fast assumptions can build, and how powerful it is to unbuild them. Sometimes growth isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, like a flower blooming after a long frost. On the last day of Community Care Week, a small boy rode his bike too fast down a cul-de-sac and fell near Elijah's car. Karen rushed outside just as Elijah stepped out of his vehicle. The boy was fine, just a scraped knee. Elijah knelt beside him and said, "You're braver than most adults I know." Karen laughed gently and handed the kid a tissue. The boy looked at both of them and asked, "Do you guys work here?" Elijah and Karen exchanged a glance. Then Karen replied, "We live here, and we care." That answer satisfied the boy. He hopped back on his bike and rode off wobbly, but smiling. Later that evening, Karen sat on her porch and watched the street. No one rushed. No one whispered behind curtains. And for the first time in a very long time, the neighborhood felt less like a gated club and more like a community. All because one man parked in the wrong spot and didn't back down when someone tried to move him. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Black Untold Stories for more powerful stories.